Alright, today's video is about transpiration, which is, in my opinion, one of the more interesting topics about plants. Transpiration is the actual movement of water through the plant and then inevitably leaving the plant at the very top where the leaves are. This is a whole process, so we're going to go through the whole thing from bottom all the way to the top. But to do that, we need to start at the roots. In order to understand how the roots work, we need to do a little recap of osmosis. Okay? So remember, osmosis is the diffusion of water from an area of a low concentration of solute to a high concentration of solute. Or on the flip side, from a high concentration of water to a low concentration of water. So if you look at this picture here, pretend this right here is outside the roots, and this here is the inside of the roots. So roots actually store up sugar intentionally, because what this does is it creates an environment in which there's a bunch of solute inside these cells, and therefore a low concentration of water. Then on the outside you have a low concentration of solute and a high concentration of water. So as you remember, molecules kind of like their personal space. They like to move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. Since there's a high concentration of water outside the roots and a low concentration of water inside the roots, the water wants to move from outside to inside because the sugar can't move itself to kind of create equilibrium. The water has to be the one that creates the equilibrium. So water in a way is actually forced into the roots by this. There's like a pressure created. We call it osmotic pressure, and it forces water into the roots. And roots actually have a bunch of little root hairs that grow on the outside, and it actually increases the surface area of the roots. Furthermore, one thing I skipped over a bit, since it's very beneficial for roots to have sugar in them, one of the reasons why, if you remember me mentioning in a previous video, sugars flow down the plant is because storing sugar in the roots makes the roots more effective at taking water from the environment. So here's a picture of a few types of root systems. And then there's also a picture of root hairs coming off the root. We'll discuss this a little more in detail in the plants, but I'm always a little shocked to see different types of roots, in particular on the corn. And if you've seen this in real life, the roots of corn look pretty crazy because they actually help support the plant a little bit as well. But maybe we'll talk about that a little more in detail in class. But here's a little cross section of a root too in the middle, right here where my mouse is, and you'll see that you have xylem and phloem in the middle because phloem has to come down through the plant, down to the roots, and then it can distribute from the middle, while the xylem is also in the middle. All that vascular tissue is concentrated in the middle. So food can go down and water can collect in the middle of the root and go up. And around that you have what's called the cortex, and that's where all the sugar actually gets stored, is in the cortex. And here's some definitions of that. We talked about xylem, talked about phloem. Once again, the cortex is that area around the xylem and phloem that stores sugars and starches, and that actually sort of forces water into the root itself. So now onto the stem. Now the stem is pretty straightforward. The stem is where you have xylem going all the way up, phloem so that food can come down. Basically, it's a connection. It's like the expressway between the leaves and the roots. A lot of the really important stuff's going on in the roots and the leaves, and the stem is, the mediator of all of that, because everything kind of goes through the stem. I like to think of the leaves and the roots as like two big cities, and the stem being the expressway between the two. Now, to understand how stuff moves through the stem, particularly water, once again we have to recall some old biochemistry concepts. I wouldn't even call this biochemistry, it's more just water chemistry. Now remember, water likes to create hydrogen bonds with itself. The hydrogen on one water molecule, pretend my hand's a water molecule I guess, will attract to the oxygen in another water molecule. It'll create this little bond between water molecules. That is called cohesion, when water molecules bond to each other. So what happens is, as water moves up, water is evaporating out the top of the leaves. It actually pulls at the water molecule below that, and then the water molecule below that, and so on and so on and so on. So water actually gets pulled up the stem by the water molecules that are evaporating out the top of the plant. Also going on throughout the stem is what's called adhesion. That's when water molecules bond to other types of molecules, such as cellulose, because the inside of the xylem has cellulose on it, and water can bond to the cellulose that is on the inside of those xylem cells, and so it doesn't, I guess, go backwards as it's. So let's say the force of cohesion, or water evaporating, kind of gets low. Well, water doesn't go back down to the plant with gravity because water actually adheres to the xylem. It's sort of like if you think of those spike strips that you draw, that if you've seen it like the airport, as you leave, you can't go backwards. Well, adhesion is a force that sort of makes it so the water can only go up and it can't go back down. So leaves are where sugar is made because that's where photosynthesis takes place. Now, just as another refresher, photosynthesis is when carbon dioxide and water react together using energy from light, and they produce glucose, a sugar, and they also produce oxygen as a waste product. Okay? Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, how do leaves actually take energy from light? Well, it requires a little bit of a physics recap. So, if you remember, the way the visible light spectrum works is you have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. Okay? Now, leaves have pigments. Now, a pigment is a material that gives something color. As you probably guessed, plants have green pigments because they are green. And what they do is they absorb certain colors of light and reflect others. In the case of leaves, most of the year they reflect back green light and absorb the other types of light, particularly red light actually. Plants really like to absorb red light. And it's that red light that they absorb, and they transfer that energy and use that energy to actually do photosynthesis. To explain all this would be a college class, by the way, but they take that energy from that light they absorb via these pigments, the main pigment being chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is that actual green pigment. Now chlorophyll is then, it absorbs that light, then transfers that energy to various enzymes and things that actually then drive photosynthesis. So as you can see, there are actually two types of chlorophyll, and they absorb different colors of light. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, leaves aren't always green? There's some different colors throughout the autumn, for example. So figured I'd fill you in on those while we were on that topic. All those colors, red, brown, yellow, those are pigments that are actually always there in the plant. But the main pigment in plants is chlorophyll, the green one. Now in the fall, photosynthesis sort of slows down, and that chlorophyll is not needed anymore, so it breaks down. Those other pigments keep going. They don't really break down. So for that brief period of time, those pigments you're actually able to see them because the chlorophyll is broken down and faded away. So in case you're wondering what those are all called, you got anthocyanin makes those red pigments, xanthophyll is what makes plants yellow, carotenoids are what makes them orange, and then tannins are kind of that brown tan color. So all four of these pigments, now it depends on the type of plant, but all four of these pigments are represented in plants most of the year. It's just you don't really see them until the chlorophyll breaks down. But back to when photosynthesis is actually taking place. So let's refocus. Now leaves, they need water also. They can't just, the light energy isn't enough. You actually need water to react with carbon dioxide to actually make the glucose. Now, you might not realize this, but leaves on the very bottom of the leaf, it's usually on the bottom, have what are called stomata. Stomatas are little pores, little openings. Actually, technically, the stoma is the pore or the opening, and there are two guard cells that surround that and open and close. Those things together are called a stomata. There's a cool picture there on the right. So stoma is the opening, and that is where water leaves and carbon dioxide enters the leaf. Then there are guard cells on the outside that will close if the leaf needs to conserve water, or it will open if the water doesn't need to conserve water and it can take in carbon dioxide. So those guard cells do a lot of that work of determining either carbon dioxide comes in and water comes out, or less carbon dioxide comes in and water stays in the leaf. So when there's a lot of water in the air, the stomata usually opens, because since there's a lot of water in the air, when it's not as dry, less water leaves the cell. And when it is really dry out, the stomata usually close, because if the stoma is open, water will come out of the atmosphere to sort of try to equalize out how much water is inside the plant and outside the plant. And when it's dry out, there's almost no water outside the plant. So there's going to be this force that pulls water out. So those stomata stay closed when it's dry out. So as water moves up the stem and attaches to the inside of the xylem, moves up, that whole process is called capillary action when it moves upwards. If you've ever taken a paper towel and soaked it and watched water move up, it's a very, very similar process. So to tie this all together, when water vapor leaves the plant, it pulls the water molecules below it in the stem, and those move upwards. And as water goes up the stem, it exits the roots, and that creates pressure that pushes water from the soil into the roots. This graphic is actually really, really good to understand all these processes together. Okay? And here's also another little recap. So first, water exits the leaves, then water is pulled up the xylem, and it's assisted by capillary action to move up the stem, and then water gets replaced in the root because water has left the roots, so water gets replaced by the process of osmosis, and eventually that water is also going to go up into the stem. So that was it. It's quite a process. This might be a video you might want to watch twice just to make sure you got all the steps down. But we will actually take a look at those stomata in class under some microscopes, and we'll discuss this more later. In the meantime, see you later.